So we'll kick straight into it, and so we can get everything sorted and put it on the website a bit later on. So thanks for joining us this morning. This is another Redline Twitter space, this time talking about Marcos and his ascent to power in the Philippines and how this will affect Philippine foreign policy going forward. And joining us today is Sabastian Strangio and Georgi Engelbrecht, two of the fantastic Southeast Asia analysts we work with all the time. So I'm going to start this and kick to Sabastian first. How much is Marcos a change from Duterte when it comes to the Philippines and their internal politics?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that the two of them have, been sort of, or the two families have been in sort of a loose alliance. So, there have been, the Marcos clan has supported Duterte going right back to the early 1990s. And there are long-standing connections between the two. Bongbong Marcos ran as Duterte's vice president in 2016. And so, one can expect a certain amount of continuity just because of this. We're seeing the same political tendency continue for another 6-year term. However, the personality differences between the two, though, have to be taken into consideration. I mean, Duterte was somebody who was very gruff, had a sort of gunslinging style, very unpredictable, very volatile in his shifts and zigzags in the way that he implemented and announced policy. And I think we can expect that at least everything I know of Bongbong Marcos is that he's likely to be there's going to be more consistency and probably more follow through on whatever policies he chooses to implement. But we're seeing the same sort of, populist characteristic, probably, a tendency to sort of a more, slightly more authoritarian mode of rule. But, really it's sort of similar, I say similar wine in, in a slightly different bottle, but we're not going to see major changes, I don't think.
And Georgie, effectively this election has been summed by a lot of people as truth versus fiction narratives, and this has been a rewriting of particularly the Marcos history, and there's been a lot of talk of fake news being quite influential in this election. Can you give us a bit of a summary on how how the election narrative has been changed by Bongbong?
Well, to be honest, I think, of course, after several journalistic exposés and other reporting on the campaign of Marcos, we know that this narrative that, the Marcos camp has been painting about, the golden age of the Philippines, the positive legacy of the father, it has been planned already, for a couple of years from the past, even before the elections. But I think essentially also, some analysts in the Philippines and other observers make it clear that it wasn't the only thing. Because, of course, you can say that the family was never really gone. They actually took advantage of the availability of social media and so forth. But essentially, they planned their return from the 90s. So they had already a very good standing before then the final, day of judgment came, so to speak. And I think they also build up on the legacy of Duterte, who also, like Sebastian said, introduced a certain style of politics on which also the Marcos clan partially has built on. Duterte promised change when he ran for president 6 years ago. Now Marcos and Duterte's daughter promised unity. All these slogans, I think, were part of a very similar playbook. And not to forget that Marcos's campaign strategy was very smart. He managed to build on alliances, and he simply ignored the very critical and tough questions, right? Because he let the facts, in a way, speak for themselves, according to him. I remember there was one interview, actually, where he was asked about disinformation, and he was blatantly saying that, well, he was offered the troll army, but he refused, and that trolls for him do not exist. So for him, probably, he simply didn't deal with these allegations. And one of the reasons why he also, I think, was elected was because many Filipinos were also dissatisfied with what came after Marcos, right? The People's Power Revolution and so forth. And it kind of changed, of course, the emphasis of the narrative. So instead of, digging out the past and martial law, instead, you kind of focus on, well, what came after wasn't that great either. And then you have, of course, a rather concentrated effort from some entities and individuals to really push into this narrative. And I think all these factors coming in together in the end concluded in his victory. So I think some people were also saying that disinformation was a part of the equation and the battle for truth as well, but it wasn't the only thing, because at the end of the day, he also knows that in order to win an election, you gotta get your votes, your alliances, and so forth completely right.
Yeah, I think that's right. Like Donald Trump in the United States, you sort of have to ask why so many people were susceptible to this sort of disinformation and the sort of message that was being put forward by the Marcos camp. And I think the only answer to that is what, like Georgi said, is 3 decades of elite failure, basically, and the brute fact that a lot of ordinary people's lives haven't really improved over the last 2 or 3 decades.
So, Georgi, I'm going to throw this question again at you. I don't think a lot of people realize how influential Facebook is inside the Philippines. Particularly the fact that Facebook, data is very, very cheap in the Philippines. And even if you run out of credit, your Facebook newsfeed is actually still available for people who run out of credit. Can you take us through just how influential Facebook has been in this election?
Well, I think, Facebook is just generally very influential in political life. I've been working before, like in Mindanao, in some areas where you don't even have good signal to text messages and so forth. But one of the easiest way to get in touch with people is through Messenger, precisely because oftentimes it's part of a package, right? So you get your phone and then you can just connect with people, and then, posts can get viral. It's very easy to get in touch with people. The Filipinos are obviously very well connected and have very good memories of their, high school fellow students, fellow college graduates. The network is there. Social media amplifies it. It's part of life. Many people spend, their time to find news, etc., on Facebook. And even when Duterte became president, a lot of the debate about the very contentious issues was carried out online. And I think Facebook in that sense is much more suitable than maybe, going on a website, or, YouTube is of course another possibility. But all the issues about the, EG case, about allegations of corruption, about Duterte's position on the West Philippine South China Sea, all of this was also intensely debated online on Facebook. And I think the elections, it's not a surprise that it basically, continued that trend where, influential bloggers and vloggers and simply, influencers and other opinion makers have used this tool. And I think that even works for the other side, when you have reasonable people also realizing, hey, we got to catch the citizenship in a way in these online town halls. But unfortunately, it can also be quite a brawl as well, right? When you have very, direct and very unbiased, less nuanced narratives that just pop up here and there. And essentially, that's what happened with the election. It was a referendum on Marcos the father, as well as a potential, discussion of we shouldn't condemn the son just because he is the son of the father, right? And I think Facebook has just amplified these discussions. And from a certain perspective, I think, it could be part of a healthy debating culture. But, we all know how it can get. And in that sense, it can also easily be exploited and manipulated.
So, Sebastian, we did see over Duterte's presidency a warming between Manila and Beijing, but obviously Marcos Senior, was very, very pro-US at the time. do you think, which direction do you think we are going to see Marcos Jr. go? Do you think we will see a continuation of warming relations with Beijing, or this will be a much more confrontational presidency?
Well, I think the first thing to realize is that good relations with Beijing are actually more the norm than the exception over the past 2 or 3 decades. I mean, the administration of President Arroyo, spoke of a golden age, I think, of Philippine-China relations, and it was really the Aquino administration that was the kind of outlier. Now, there were obvious reasons for that. The Chinese were beginning to assert their power in disputed areas of the South China Sea, including in areas that really belong to the Philippines under any reasonable interpretation of international law. And the reaction of the Aquino government was very was a staunch reaction. They took China to the arbitral tribunal and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, which the Philippines won essentially on most of its claims. And Aquino employed very strong language against Beijing. But the general trend line has been, improving relations between the two countries. So I think, based on what Marcos has said, and he's been very, vague, on a lot of questions of policy since the beginning of the presidential campaign. But what he said, is that he intends to have good relations with China. He intends to have productive relations. And I think what he really is aiming for is to quarantine these disputes from more productive parts of the relationship, such as trade and investment. I think one difference we'll likely see is that with Duterte, there was a strong anti-American animus that underpinned his swing against the United States and his embrace of China. There was personal resentments bound up with that as well. The role of the U.S. going historically in Mindanao was something that he harped on. Personal slights, friends and allies of his being refused U.S. visas. The activity of U.S. special forces in the southern Philippines. There were lots of issues that figured into his this sort of bouquet of resentments that made him very sensitive toward any American criticism. And of course, there was the war on drugs, which elicited strong reactions from the U.S. with the Obama administration at the time. And so, I do think that Marcos is likely to be less reflexively anti-American. I think he's probably likely to gravitate more toward this sort of, generally, pro-U.S. Position of the security and political establishment in the Philippines, which by some measures is more pro-American than the United States itself. So, I do think he's going to be close to the United States and attempt to balance that with productive relations with China. Whether he can manage this, of course, is another question. I mean, a lot depends on how the U.S. approaches Marcos. I mean, the sense that he's sort of this authoritarian figure who's gotten back to power through through corruption and sort of the manipulation of stolen money and all of these sorts of things. If the U.S. takes a strong sort of human rights-based line with Marcos, I think you could see a lot of tension in the relationship. But from everything I know about what the discussions going on in Washington right now, I think that the outcome is likely to be more pragmatic, and we're likely to see a marked improvement in U.S.-Philippine relations.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think even when we look at Duterte, it's been quite remarkable to also see that his policy was not per se also very consistent throughout time. Like we all know how he started off, and towards a couple of years into his term, he got rid of the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement. But there was a shift towards the end, right? And I believe it actually started around the time of the pandemic, when actually you have these other players like the armed forces, the diplomats, and so forth, and of course the Philippine public also exerting pressure. And I think Duterte could not resist, right? That's why he probably had to, switch course. And I think that is probably something that could be the template for Marcos Jr. So he's also been talking about the so-called independent foreign policy, not really clearly laying out what it is, but emphasizing that we have to speak to China, which makes them different from Aquino and his rather rigorous stance, and following really Duterte's footsteps. So in that sense, there could be really an interesting, continuity there. The question is, what about the two superpowers? How will they, how far will they go with that pressure on perhaps, seeking more support from Marcos than currently exists from the Philippines in the broader geopolitical dispute?
Do you think we're likely to see the continuation of the drug war and the ramping up of the fight against the insurgencies in the south? This was something that was quite big under Duterte. Will it be a central pillar of the Marcos administration as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think Marcos, in an interview, he said that Duterte told him that you have to work on the drug problem, on the drug issue. And I think Marcos probably agrees with it in general terms. But I think the consensus is we will not see what has happened at the beginning of the Duterte presidency, of course. He seems to be more into rehabilitation efforts and so forth. But even there, we don't really know because his policies are less explained and laid out. With the South, it will really depend because both peace processes, or the lack thereof in the case of the communist rebels, are kind of very complicated. So Marcos oversees a transition in Mindanao that has now, slightly changed in its political direction because of the local elections. So whatever he will do, the appointments he will make, and his general strategy will impact this political transition. Usually, the security situation has generally improved over the last years, thanks to the peace process, of course, but also Duterte's approach against existing militant groups in the south. So for now, we're still, in a status quo position. But if the peace process is botched, then of course we could expect more insecurity, and then Marcos will simply, have to act because a few years ago, when he was one of the resource persons in many Senate hearings and so forth on the peace agreement, he always emphasized the importance of constitutionality, following the process, territorial integrity, and I think he will be firm in that sense. With the communists, there's no peace process really on a strategic level, there are no talks. He could think of restarting it, as many Philippine presidents do, but for now, I think he will follow the status quo, which is kind of a mix of, socioeconomic doleouts in many parts of the Philippines, coupled with counterinsurgency. And I think the incentives for him to really fix this issue are not that high at present. So probably he'll be acting from a rather, reactive position, whilst at the same time following through with his key, notions about both peace processes. But the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is, we still don't know who will handle national security, Department of National Defense, and so forth, peace process advisor. So hopefully this will tell us in the next days or weeks where he would go with that.
So, Sebastian, we have seen Marcos say that he will defend the territorial sovereignty of the Philippines in territorial waters, particularly in the South China Sea. But how far do you think he is willing to push that? Will we see, similar to what we have seen with the Indonesians in the very south of the South China Sea, a pushback against Indonesian against Chinese fishing boats, or frankly, he'll fight the war, he'll fight the battles he thinks he can win?
Well, I mean, it's sort of something he has to say. This is very important for domestic politics. It's worth remembering that pretty much the one area in which President Duterte was his popularity was relatively low was on his China policy, and on the question of the West Philippine Sea, as Manila refers to its sections of the South China Sea. Um, and so I think that it's only to be expected that Marcos would talk tough about defending these Philippine features and the Philippines, the waters claimed by the Philippines in the South China Sea. What exactly, eventuates, I'm not sure that it will be all up to him. I mean, the Philippines finds itself in a very tricky position with regard to the South China Sea disputes. It's the only South China Sea claimant state that is also a U.S. treaty ally. And given the increasing tensions between the U.S. and China, the Philippines is in a very difficult position. It could conceivably find itself on the front line of a conflict between these two superpowers, and so it's incredibly challenging to balance the need for, deterrence and sort of to defend the need to defend these ocean reaches from Chinese encroachments. But it's also, I mean, he would be aware, I'm sure, and he's actually, in fact, he said this, that, a war is something that the Philippines does not want and probably couldn't win. And so, and certainly not a war where the United States and China were fighting in areas close to the Philippines. And so, I do think that he will probably see a similar sort of combination of diplomatic démarches toward the Chinese. In fact, I think there was one just yesterday about incursions into the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, while Marcos will continue to seek Chinese investment, in the same way that Duterte did. And this balancing act will continue on, and it's just a question, I think, of what probably will end up having more of an impact will be what happens in Beijing and Washington. But yeah, I think that this sort of tough talk is only to be expected, and it remains to be seen what he actually does when faced with these incursions.
Yeah, Sebastian, I think in your book you also described this a trip to Palawan, right? The most western frontier province of the Philippines, at the
Right.
forefront of the maritime sea disputes. I mean, a lot of talk is about ETCA, this manifestation of the alliance that could give the U.S. access to bases in the Philippines, and I think it's interesting to see how that one will play out, because a few years back, Marcos was slightly skeptical of such an initiative in his function as a senator. Right now, the tensions between China and the US are increasing. And like you also said, I mean, there will be probably some policy suggestions coming up. And internally, you have also different views. You have those who advocate for clarity on the alliance, probably to really, commit to a certain extent and give the US what it wants. On the other hand, you also have the fact that some Filipinos remain skeptical about it and would want to preserve their independence. The question is, how sustainable is this balancing act? And I think that will be really interesting to see, because Marcos as well is, a man of, different tendencies, both in his person perhaps, but also in his immediate environment. And I think the key for the Philippines should also be to really see, okay, what are your strategic priorities, your red lines actually, and what do you want to achieve? Like, do you have a plan for your hedging of sorts? Because if you improvise along the way, that might also, result in some fissures that could again, lead to incidents. And again, maybe the question, what's going to happen?
So, Sebastian, how far, if they are going in a more pro-US direction for this presidency, how far do you think that will go? Do you think we'll see the Filipinos doing large joint operations like the Japanese do in the South China Sea with the Americans? Or, there has been some talk amongst, Marcos supporters, and particularly on the campaign, of them retaking the Scarborough Shoal. How far does this, push back against China actually go?
Well, again, I mean, that sort of bluster is, that exuberance, is very much par for the course for the campaign trail. But retaking the Scarborough Shoal you would require active armed confrontation with China, and that's something that I think is unlikely to happen. I mean, look, I think again, is what I mentioned before. The sort of center of gravity for the Philippine political and security establishment is very pro-United States. So we're likely to see, I think, a return to that sort of historical mean. I see no particular reason why Marcos will avoid that. But I do think that how far that translates into sort of an active attempt to push back against China in the South China Sea really remains to be seen. I think that it's. Unfortunately, I think probably what is more likely is that the Philippines will continue to meddle through, rather to muddle through, to sort of, continue sort of hedging and issuing strong denunciations of Chinese actions, while, strengthening its relationship with the United States. But it's, until there is some sort of, barring some sort of much more aggressive move by the Chinese, I think we're probably going to see the cycles that we've seen recently play out of Chinese incursions, Philippine denunciations and protests, rinse, wash, and repeat.
Do you think we're likely to see China put more money into the Philippine economy and invest more into it now? I'm going to throw this one at Georgi.
Yeah, that's a good question, right? I mean, I think over the last years, there are kind of two schools of thought on the so-called pivot to the Philippines by Beijing. So you have those who would emphasize that within the greater sphere of the BRI and so forth, there has been more, promises than really substantive outcomes. Only a couple of projects are, completed, fulfilled. At some point, China claimed that even, drug rehab centers in Mindanao have been part of their BRI initiative, which arguably may or may not be the case. But I think on the other hand, you also have facts such as, the growing trade between both countries. You also have, increasing foreign direct investment as well coming from China. And for all it's worth, you also have the inflow of other capital. And that has been, also discussed in among some scholars about really the kind of invisible influence, arguably also positive perhaps, that has reached Manila. Of course, the key here internally were the online gambling firms that became a bit of a hot potato, of course, during the pandemic, but even a bit before. But from the other side of it, apart from social costs that they brought with them, you also had small scale employment, contribution to local businesses and economies. A lot of folks from China were living here in Manila. Contributing to also rising prices in real estate and so forth. And I think you have also other developments that happened during Duterte's era. So it's nothing that we really see directly, because apart from Chinese perspectives, you also have the Filipinos and the bureaucracy around Duterte, the local elites that are of course measuring, is this worth it? And I think right now, it will be important to see how will Beijing look at the Philippines at this day and age. Because I think if the lens is still that it's pretty much a solid ally of the United States, then the question is, will they try to give more carrots, or is it actually a bit of a lost case, at least with respect to, the grand projects or infrastructure things that usually China try to cajole other countries into. So I think the overall result of their commitment is perhaps mixed, but it's certainly more than zero. And there were some things that influenced the economy, but I'm not sure what the lessons are from that for the coming presidency. Because, like Sebastian said, if we see again a tilt or a continuation towards the US on a broader strategic level, probably Beijing will think, all right, is this worth it now? Do we really want to convince the Philippines to go more into the middle, or do we actually try to use other avenues to still stay relevant?
So, Sebastian, in this current Indonesian presidency, we have seen a much more robust role inside ASEAN and a lot more outreach from Jakarta into ASEAN. Do you think we might see the same from Marcos and him trying to make better relations with the other ASEAN nations, or frankly, this will be a much more domestically focused presidency?
Look, I think if you're the president or of a country like the Philippines or Indonesia, we're talking about very polycentric, complex nations with a lot of challenges. They're the two most populous nations in Southeast Asia. They are made up of sort of these vociferous island geographies that include a lot of regions that have historically resisted the control of the central state. I think there tends to be a strong centripetal sort of tendency in the leaderships of a lot of these countries. I mean, Jokowi has been, his personal inclination has been to focus on domestic issues, but over the past quarter century, or since the fall of Suharto, sort of consolidating and developing the Indonesian nation, building the Indonesian nation state has been a project that's still very much in progress. And so I think that there's a certain amount of domestic focus that will be forced on Marcos when he takes office at the end of the month. Georgie might be able to comment on this in more detail, but to my knowledge, the Philippines has never been a particularly active nation in terms of leadership within ASEAN, to my knowledge. And so I wouldn't expect that to change, though. We have seen the Philippines, along with Indonesia and Malaysia, take a stronger line and push for a stronger line on the crisis in Myanmar within ASEAN, and to sort of try and bend the Southeast Asian bloc more in the direction of a more sort of interventionist and a harder line on the Myanmar junta. But there's nothing about Marcos that I am aware of that suggests that he's going to be taking a very strong, very active role in trying to rally a sort of Southeast Asian, position on anything. I think the one time we did see an active, or relatively active Philippine position on within ASEAN was during the after the Scarborough Shoal confrontation with China in 2012, and that led to the infamous incident at the Cambodian ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in mid 2012, when the Cambodians intervened to block a Philippine-sponsored joint communique calling out China for its actions in the South China Sea. But it remains to be seen if we'll see that sort of activism under Marcos.
Yeah,
Georgi, can make. Well,
I
you say, Georgi, want to make a comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Philippines, it's a great team player for ASEAN, right? But I also think precisely because of the aftermath of Scarborough, there may have been also been, a hangover over the nature and possibility for the entity to drive the process. I think there's some debates here among policymakers in what sense we can bank on ASEAN as, as something that can steer forward, processes that could help resolving the maritime disputes, or more generally, deal with the maritime domain in the region, for example, fisheries cooperation and so forth. But I think most of these discussions are still rather academic, and there are cooperation initiatives, but they're still, very, very, very informal and subdued. But I think one interesting element could be simply the nature of the Marcos family. I mean, we all know how Imelda was on the world stage, what also Ferdinand Marcos tried to, portray himself as the statesman who had access to Nixon, to Reagan, and to other world leaders. So I'm not sure if this ambition is also in his son, but I wouldn't say it's completely impossible. And it could be interesting to see that maybe here and there you would have these flashes of commitment to the outside, even though, like Sebastian said, the priorities are definitely more internal and domestic rather than external at the moment.
So we're going to start to bring this this space to a bit of a close, but to ask a question to sort of finish it off, I'm going to ask this to both of you. What do you think will be the biggest priorities over the next 6 years, and what do you think will be the biggest changes in the Philippines over this presidency? And I'm going to start with Sebastian.
Well, I mean, I'm less less familiar with the domestic situation in the Philippines. I mean, I would say that every nation in Southeast Asia right now is facing economic struggles, which due to the COVID pandemic, which are only going to get worse with rising global food prices. I mean, we've seen a number of nations in Southeast Asia now impose quite protectionist measures to protect either to protect local industries or to maintain domestic price stability. I do think that economics will probably be one of the dominant challenges. Obviously, there are perennial security challenges in the Philippines, which Georgi could probably expand on in more detail. But these are things that every Philippine president, virtually since independence, has had to deal with to some degree. But I do think that creating inclusive development is really going to be should be the key challenge of the Marcos administration. Of course, inclusive development has been something that has been very elusive in the Philippines, and arguably is one of the reasons that we're seeing we've seen a Marcos return to the presidential palace after 36 years since the People Power Revolution. Is that there really hasn't been sort of the deep reform that the country needs, land reform, other forms of economic reform that would break the stranglehold of these political dynasties and landed elites, and and create a more broad-based form of prosperity. But I don't think that the Marcos, for obvious reasons, the Marcos agenda is going to go that far. But I definitely think economics would be the thing that he should focus on, during his 6-year term.
And Georgi, what do you think will be the biggest goals of the Marcos administration, and what do you think will change in the Philippines over the next 6 years?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the more things change in the Philippines, like elsewhere, the more still remains the same, right? I mean, you have certain fundamentals that probably will not go away, like the political structure of the country, the nature of political dynasties being highly influential, and also this always, this push and pull between Manila and really the local centers elsewhere. So now again, like in the beginning of the Duterte administration, you have again a nascent discussion of on federalism, right? Even though it's not really clear what it would mean in practice, I think there's broad agreement among many scholars and also Filipinos that, all right, our governance system could probably be adjusted in order to bring shades of this inclusive development that also Sebastian mentioned. But politically, it will be difficult to pull off, of course. And now I think it's the time to try. It's again voices, even from within the administration, talk about going federal and so forth, but it's really complicated. So I'm not sure how successful it will be. And in the end, we could just end up with the status quo. That's exactly what happened to Duterte. In the short term, it's of course economics. And if you look at the cabinet members that Marcos called up for his team, most of the positive feedback he's getting is precisely for those financial and economic experts, because right now inflation is hitting hard. The country is still recovering from the pandemic. The gas prices are increasing week by week, and there's also pressure on the incoming administration to really deliver. And I think he's cognizant of that. Like he emphasized that spending needs to be very wise and so forth. But again, we'll probably see it in his first months. For the peace and order situation and the peace processes, it is, I guess, every president will get this legacy and just takes it from there. So I think for Marcos, it will be just important not to botch the peace process with the more Islamic Liberation Front and the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. That will definitely be a key priority. That should be a key priority, but we'll see how Marcos' administration will look at it, because, as I said earlier, we don't know who will be the people who will support him in this. No big changes, perhaps, on the communist front, like business as usual. But I guess, if the economic situation will not improve, and if, governance will still face challenges in many provinces, this, oldest insurgency in Asia of the communist nature simply fade away. It could be weakened, but it will definitely continue. But most of the presidents in history have also reacted to this rather than really solving it, for a more sustainable result. So I guess we'll see how it will go from there.
So I want to say a huge thanks to Sabastian Strangio, the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat, and Georgi Engelbrecht, who's a senior analyst focusing on the Philippines for Crisis Group. It's been absolutely fantastic having you both on. This Twitter space will remain on Twitter, so you can listen back to it for the next week or so. And then afterwards, we will put it on our website and YouTube channel as well for the people who are, I know it's the middle of the night for the Americans and the Europeans, which is very odd for me doing a panel this early in the morning with being in Australia. But thank you so much to both of you for jumping on and chatting about the Philippines. I think it's a very important subject to be talking about, particularly when it comes to the South China Sea. And we look forward to having you back on the show sometime soon.